Good afternoon to all of you. Happy New Year. And thank you very much for making it back to the room despite the late hours and many demands on your time. But I'm not surprised that you're back in the room, given the quality of the panel that has been assembled as the last panel, personal company excluded. And it is my pleasure to be moderating that panel, not only to reflect on the overall discussions of the three last panels, which have been indeed very rich, dense, and not necessarily unanimous, quite to the contrary, which was exactly the point of what certainly at the IMF, together with the Bundesbank, we wanted to achieve, which was to actually have many views debated in order to make progress and to facilitate further discussions and eventual deliberations and action. I'm very lucky to have four top-notch panelists. Benoît Coeuré, who is a member of the ECB's Executive Board, where he's responsible for international and European relations, market operations, and payment systems. Prior to joining the ECB, he held various policy positions at the French Treasury. Caveat and disclaimer as far as Benoît is concerned, because it's the first day of his frozen period.
Quiet.
He will not, huh?
Quiet period.
Yeah, quiet. which means that you have to keep your mouth frozen. So he will not address monetary policy issues. Yeah. So for those people from the media who will be tempted to comment on the fact that he hasn't said anything about monetary policy, what is wrong? Nothing wrong, he's just following the rules. Well, I will introduce the other panelists as we come along, but Marcel Fratzscher needs no introduction. I will do that. President of the DIW Berlin, one of the leading economic research institutes and think tanks in Europe. He's also a professor of macroeconomics and finance at Humboldt University in Berlin. President Mario Monti is currently president of Bocconi University. He was previously Prime Minister of Italy and Minister of Economy and Finance of Italy. Since 2014, he's been chairman of the high-level group on, I quote, own resources of the European Union. And finally, Professor Christoph Schmidt, who's president of RWI, a leading center for economic research and evidence-based policy advice in Germany. He's also chairman of the German Council of Economic Experts. So we're going to start with you, Benoît, and the topic you've been assigned is lessons from the crisis. Is there unfinished business? You will probably concur with me that the global economy is doing a lot better, firing on many cylinders, and that policymakers can perhaps begin to turn from crisis fighting to other issues. And as I've said many times, when the sun is shining, it's time to fix the roof. Not all roofs are the same, and I would like to hear from you where you think there is unfinished business on a European area basis, Euro area basis predominantly, and Germany as well. And are there some quick wins that would convince some of our various compatriots within Europe that it's really worth the adventure?
So thank you very much for the invitation and good evening to everyone. And I would like to first to commend the IMF and Bundesbank for setting up that for hosting that conversation, which is incredibly useful. And I hope we can do that in as many countries as possible in Europe. Mm-hmm. I think the way you introduced the discussion is exactly the right one, because it says a lot about the timeliness of that discussion. The global economy is doing better. The Eurozone economy is driven or benefits from tailwinds, different kind of tailwinds, and that's exactly the right time to have that discussion. We ourselves at the ECB, we've stopped saying that we want to strengthen the recovery. It's not a recovery anymore, it's an expansion. And it's not about moving out of the previous crisis. It's about preparing for the next crisis and the next recession and being as strong as possible when it comes. And the later the better, obviously, but we have to prepare for that. So when you think about the kind of lessons that we've learned through this crisis, and to put it very simply, I would say that what we've learned through this crisis, and which should guide, inform our policy discussion, is that the Eurozone as a monetary union really needs 3 lines of defense to be ready, to be fit for purpose, to be ready to cope with shocks. First line of defense is about well-functioning markets in each and every economy. So that has nothing to do with the ground discussion on, you know, fiscal union, new institutions, etc. It's just about making each and every economy work better, being more flexible, being better equipped to absorb shocks. It's also about the single market. In particular, I would say the single market in services, where still a lot can be done. So that's about making sure also that any crisis can be dealt with through market mechanisms, which in my view is the first best solution, because that's about price signal, that's about individual behaviors, and that spares political capacity. So the more can be absorbed through markets, the less the need for difficult political discussions in Brussels, nights spent in Brussels, consuming a lot of political capital that then governments cannot use for their own reforms and cannot use to move forward. We don't want to spend political capital to address the legacy. We should spend political capital to prepare for the future. But for that, we need well-functioning economies, and we're not yet there. So that's the first conclusion. We need a lot to do a lot to strengthen individual economies in terms of structural reforms and making the single market work better. Second line of defense is about having well-functioning fiscal policies, and that's a little bit the initial spirit of the initial contract that was signed back in 1999. And for that, you need proper fiscal buffers. You need well-functioning fiscal policies so that countries are able to cope with shocks. And again, here we're not yet there. There is a need for many countries to rebuild fiscal buffers. And given the economic environment we're in, which you mentioned, Madam MD, that's exactly the right time to do it, to rebuild the fiscal buffers in countries that need it. And I would say that's most of the countries today in the monetary union. And the third line of defense, but it's only the third line of defense, is about having joint mechanisms to cope with large shocks. And that's where, say, the discussion on making the ESM stronger fits in, which I think is a relevant discussion to have. And I'm not going into the details here. But that's only for large shocks. And when the first 2 lines of defense have been used. And by the way, the first line of defense also includes banking union, obviously, because that's about having risk sharing through markets, through individual decisions, also in the financial sector. And for that, we need the banking union and the capital market union. So that's how I would see the kind of efforts that we have to do now along these 3 buckets. And the first 2 buckets, you've noted that, are national. It's all national. Only the third one requires European institutions and joint action. Now, why is it so important? Why are we having that discussion in a conference on Germany? Well, because you're asking for it, which is, I think, the best answer. But because Germany is part of that discussion at both ends of that discussion. Of course, Europe needs Germany for that discussion to take place, not only for political reasons, but also because Germany has to be part of the effort to make growth stronger and to reduce imbalances. And I know a lot of the discussion today has been about imbalances, current account imbalances. Europe is already is part of the global imbalance discussion. Europe is having an enormous current account surplus. We have a responsibility to the world to make our growth as balanced as possible. Germany, being 20% of the Eurozone, has a huge contribution. You don't even need to discuss spillovers. Spillovers would increase that responsibility. And I'm probably on the side of those who believe that the spillovers are relatively limited. I don't think there's that much scope for that discussion. But even before that, given the mere weight of Germany, the sheer weight of Germany, making German growth as balanced as possible is already going a long way towards making Eurozone growth sustainable and balanced, and that's a contribution to global stability. And on the other side, and that's my last remark, having a strong and stable Eurozone will benefit Germany enormously. And it's not only because Germany is an exporter, which is probably the most, what would jump to mind if you're having that discussion. So this is not only about sustaining demand for German products outside of Germany. It's also about financial stability in the Eurozone. It's also about limiting risks in the Eurozone. There is a lot of discussion on risk reduction. And many would agree, we agree at the ECB, that risk reduction should go along with risk sharing, and that there is a lot of scope for risk reduction in the Eurozone, given what we're coming from. But diversification is part of risk reduction. Integration is part of risk reduction. So if we can have, coming back again to the banking union, if we can have a properly functioning banking union with capital and liquidity flowing throughout the system, with large banks operating across borders, that's part of risk reduction. Because as we know, diversification is also a way to reduce risk. So that's one first thing. And I think I have to say as an ECB representative, is that the better the Eurozone will be equipped, will be fit to absorb shocks, the less you'll have to rely on the ECB. We've been able to do a lot of the heavy lifting during this crisis with new instruments, facing unprecedented challenges, unprecedented issues. We've been able to do it within our mandate, complying with our legal mandate, and that has been confirmed by the European Court of Justice. I just don't know what the next crisis will look like. So I want to be sure that when the next crisis hits, the ECB is not driven into testing the limits of its mandate. And I think that's probably an argument that should resonate here in Germany. That the stronger the Eurozone, the better the institutions of the Eurozone, the better the mix between risk sharing and risk reduction in the Eurozone, the less you have to test the mandate of the ECB. I think that's a very important lesson for the future. So my bottom line here is Germany is on both sides of the discussion. And if you want the Eurozone to thrive, you need a lot to be done at the level of member states, including Germany, but obviously also all the other member states. And so you started from the roof being manned or fixed when the sun is shining. But there is another Kennedy quote that I would like to use, or maybe misuse or misquote. And so my conclusion would be, don't ask what Europe can do for you. Ask yourself what you can do for Europe.
Thank you very much, Benoît. Excellent. Just a quick question, because lines of defense are interesting description of what is needed. Do you see those lines of defense operating in successive order, or do you see them as being activated jointly, concurrently? The two domestics that you've mentioned and the euro area one.
That's an important question. I think it depends a lot whether you're discussing what happens before a crisis or after a crisis. After a crisis, you probably need all instruments together, because you cannot given the magnitude of the shocks we've been facing, we had to use all instruments. But before the crisis, a lot of the prevention is about the first line of defense and the second line of defense that I have outlined. That is, if you have well-functioning markets within countries, good reforms in countries, you also reduce the likelihood of a crisis. So there you have a clear priority.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. I want to now turn to what it means for Germany and the euro area, and I'm going to turn to you, Marcel, now. What happens in Germany is not only important domestically, although politicians would tend to focus on that predominantly first, but it's also very important for the rest of the euro area. I think we heard twice in the course of the day that Germany represents roughly 20% in terms of weighted participation in various institutions, including the ECB, and the role it plays macroeconomically is critically important as well. You've written extensively on policy priorities for Germany. Your writings don't necessarily reconcile exactly with the priorities of the government, including on the best way for it to prepare for the future. So what should be the focus of economic policies in Germany to address those longer-term challenges while also fostering a strong and sustainable euro area? Guide us.
First of all, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Now, the feeling in Germany at the moment is that we are the economic superstar. Our economy is booming, we have these big successes, and if it were not for the rest of Europe, Germany would be doing even better. And I think that's a very dangerous situation. So it makes really what I see in terms of economic policy, Germany very complacent. And one of the observations is that we haven't really seen fundamental economic reforms, be it on the tax side, be it on structural reforms, for a long time. And one chart I usually like to show when I look at Germany, and I don't do this here, but I just describe it mentally, is to compare France, Spain, and Germany since the year 2000 in terms of GDP. And if you look at cumulative growth since 2000, you see that France actually grew 3% more than Germany since 2000, and Spain by 10% more. And when I do that, people usually are very shocked and say, how can that be? Germany is doing so well, and Spain had this deep crisis, and France is not doing well. And we like to forget that Germany was a sick man of Europe only 10, 12 years ago. And what we're experiencing at the moment, to a large extent, is a catching up of a lost decades in the 2000s. So I think we need to put it a little bit more into this long-term perspective. And I want to talk about 4 recommendations, and you asked me to summarize a little bit what Germany should do and how that also contributes to Europe. And the first 3 kind of are the flip side of the big economic success stories of Germany over the past 15 years. Fiscal policy, on labor market policies, and on competitiveness. And if you look at fiscal policy, Germany is one of the few countries that has had surpluses. I mean, these 3 issues, by the way, are the 3 first sessions we had, of course, at the conference. And if you look at fiscal policy, this has been described. Germany is one of the few countries that had fiscal surpluses since 2012, 2013. Now, the key point is that it's really mainly a result of good luck rather than good policy that Germany is doing so well. It has to do with 3 facts: low interest rates, which many Germans like to ignore, particularly when they criticize the ECB, is that also according to studies by the Bundesbank, that if you compare interest rates before the global financial crisis to today, the general government saves about 40 to 45 billion annually in terms of interest payments. And you could deduct that and look at the fiscal surplus of around about 40 billion per year, and you realize Germany would not have a black zero, but rather have a deficit. Second, very important contributing factor is a very strong labor market, and we talked about demographics, that this is not going to last. And the third one is unusually high corporate profits. So all 3 issues are really extraordinary and basically highlight, if you look at German fiscal policy, it's not as sound and solid as it would seem if you really look at the underlying factors. Now, what worries me even more, and that's maybe an additional point that hasn't come out today so much, is that when you look at net investment, Germany actually has negative net public investment. So the depreciation of the official capital stock has been higher than new investment. And yes, some participants this morning have made that point. The growth rate of public investment in recent years has been quite decent, but the level is so low that net public investment is still negative. So the German government essentially is living off its substance. If you look at the real net capital stock in Germany of the public sector, you see that this has declined by between 15 and 20% of GDP over the past 20 years. So clearly there has been a very strong shift away from public investment towards public consumption. And that's clearly a weakness, in particular if you look at demographics and consider also contingent liabilities, you realize that the public sector is not nearly as strong as it should be. I want to say one word on the current discussion on tax cuts in Germany. And the feeling is, what should we do with the big surplus? And it reminds me very much of the Trump tax cut, because what is being under discussion is cut income taxes and reduce corporate taxes. And I would find that a huge mistake to use that surplus for these tax cuts, not for fairness reasons, but really for economic reasons, because you want to do corporate tax cuts when your corporate sector lacks competitiveness, corporates have very low earnings so that they cannot invest, and when the tax burden is relatively high in international comparison. And none of these 3 apply to Germany. I mean, we saw these big export growth rates, current account surpluses. German companies, particularly export companies, are doing extremely well. Corporate taxes are not high in international comparison. They're not low either, but they're really somewhere in the middle. And earnings are at a record high. I mean, German companies are looking for investment opportunities. And I would really think this would be very counterproductive to conduct pro-cyclical fiscal policies and do that in times where Germany is doing well. Now, my first point on fiscal policy is clearly prioritize public investment to have positive net investment. Second, adjust the rules. So I'm not criticizing the black zero, the schwarze Null. I think in good times, Germany should have surpluses. But the debt brake that Germany has implemented 10 years ago has contributed to a shift away from public investment towards public consumption, because what do you do in bad times? You cut investment first. And what's happening in good times, public investment is not recovering. That's what we have been seeing. So adjust the rules. This, by the way, also applies to European rules, but equally to German fiscal rules, to prioritize really investment to balance that. And the third one, this is just a tiny point on municipal investment. More than half of investment is done by the municipalities. And you have around about 1/3 of German municipalities that are over-indebted, that cannot invest as much as they would like to and should. So these would be my first points on fiscal policy. Prioritize towards public investment, really try to fix that problem. The second one is on competitiveness, and we discussed the big current account surplus. German export companies are hugely successful. The current account surplus is not the fault of excessive exports. I think that's just the wrong criticism. It's really a problem of a lack of private investment. Now, more importantly, is that we often too much look at the export sector and ignore the non-tradables, the services sectors in many cases. And Germany really has a dual economy. One part of the economy, very productive, high rates of productivity, high wages. These are usually the tradables, the export sectors, doing incredibly well. But we often ignore the other part, the services sectors, where you have very low investment, we have very low productivity, you have low wages, but the bulk of employment and the rising share of employment is in that sector. And that's often ignored. And the IMF in its Article 4 often, and the EU Commission often say, oh, look, we need to deregulate services sectors. That should be really one huge priority, because here is huge potential. And I think that's getting too little attention to really create more competition, more private investment. Now, on private investment, and I'm chairing or chair the committee of the expert committee for the German government on raising investment. If you ask companies, so why do you invest so little in Germany and invest more abroad? You usually get a very clear answer, and it has to do with poor regulatory infrastructure. You have too much bureaucracy. Sometimes you need permissions that take 5, 6, 7 years to construct buildings. It's increasingly a lack of skilled workers in certain areas. It's a poor digital infrastructure. Germany has one of the worst digital infrastructures in all of Europe, a worsening transport infrastructure. So you have many, many elements that are the responsibility of policy. So it's not to say policy has no responsibility here, really keep a responsibility to improve this environment for private investment. That would be my second priority for Germany. The third one has to do with the labor market. We saw this big boom in the labor market. Employment is rising, unemployment is falling. But what we often ignore is that the hours worked, so the labor supply, or the hours worked, actually has hardly increased. So we have seen a massive increase in atypical investment, a massive increase in part-time, so the labor market is not as strong as it should be. A relatively modest labor productivity is an important feature, and an increasing mismatch. I mentioned the lack of skilled workers. Germany has a low unemployment rate, but it also has an unusually large amount of open jobs. So companies looking for skilled and unskilled workers. So really investing in education and qualification is absolutely a big priority, also to tackle wage inequality, income inequality, which I think is an increasing problem for Germany, not for fairness or justice reasons, but really for economic reasons. And the IMF has been doing important research, others have been doing important research to say inequality, if it really hampers equality of opportunity, is really an impediment to growth. And just a very final, very quick fourth point is on Europe. I think in Germany, my worry is that we are turning inward, that the feeling is European reforms at the moment are not necessary because Europe is doing well. The feeling is mainly what the other Europeans want from us is our money. We are supposed to pay more, and we are the paymaster. So there is not this realization that what Benoît put very nicely is Germany is benefiting a lot from Europe. We are a very open economy. We're benefiting from European integration, and completing monetary union, implementing the needed reforms should be an absolute key priority for the next government.
Thank you very much, Marcel. That gives me a great segue into Mario's focus on other countries than Germany, even though Germany will also be part of the presentation. I had deliberately omitted your European background and credentials, Mario, to justify the fact that now I can defer to European sagacity, intelligence, and expertise that you've accumulated over the years in your various positions in Brussels. But you've seen it from all vantage points. Policymakers, academic, European leading actor. What is going to be needed at the euro area level, please?
First of all, thank you so much for the invitation. Secondly, I wish to focus on one component of German economic policy, that is its influence on overall EU policy making. And I will try to address your questions, Christine, because we all know that the influence of Germany is enormous, either because of its leadership, intended or unintended, or because of its ability to block, or because of the little daringness of others to move when there is even just a suspicion that Germany might not agree. So we are at a rather refounding moment. A coalition agreement is about to be hopefully finalized. There is new momentum in Franco-German cooperation. Documents are produced. What to expect from Germany? Well, if I may take a slightly longer historical perspective, I think Germany's contributions to the EU and to the Eurozone have been characterized by three very, very strong assets for us, for all of us Europeans. One, the emphasis brought by Germany on the structural aspects. Two, the emphasis brought on the long term, giving less importance to short-termism. And thirdly, the inherent simplicity of German economic policy references and models, because they understood, in my view, better than others, that to have the public opinion understand the frame of reference of policy making is important for the effectiveness of that policy making. So as we have perhaps a reshaping of EU economic policy making, what would these, to me, perennial principles of German benefits to the EU would have to bring us? Well, let me touch just on two subject matters. One is national budgets. The other one is the EU budget. National budget, that is the whole topic, of course, of fiscal rules. First of all, concerning the national budget in Germany, I couldn't agree more with Marcel on the need for Germany to prioritize investment. He has been a great advocate of this. And I think that a stronger emphasis on this by the German government will also, by the way, imply some steps like those advocated by Benoît on further liberalizing the services markets. And a stronger emphasis on investments in the conduct of German public finance, to me, would also mean that we should finally have a strong, intellectually hard-fought public debate in Europe on whether we should still comply with the deference or not to the idiosyncratic restrictions that the German mindset sees on the notion of public debt. I think the EU has done well and will continue to do well to accommodate at 98% to the principles of the soziale Marktwirtschaft and all the other principles so dear to Germans. But maybe we Europeans should help Germans to come out of that partly linguistic straitjacket which leads them to view the public debt in all circumstances as something which inhibits even them from pursuing better economic policy courses. And I believe that when Marcel has his strong insistence on investment, the counterpart is also partly to reflect on whether many forms of the investments he advocates would not make sense, especially under the current economic circumstances, even if financed partly by indebtedness. And when this morning Daniel mentioned the ingenious idea of a sovereign wealth fund for Germany, with the federal government taking money from the German citizens, it remains to be seen whether that is bond issuing, whether it is postal deposits, but I think it would have to be indebtedness vis-à-vis the public in order to invest in higher return assets vis-à-vis the rest of the world, like the Norwegians do. Well, I think that's important also because it helps us understand pedagogically that if those high yield assets were to be against domestic Germany and not against the rest of the world, it would still make sense to have some indebtedness in order to go into a more modern digital infrastructure, etc., etc. So, in other words, I believe that when we need to revise the fiscal rules in Europe, because as many said today, there is no credibility, there is no enforcement, there is nothing more left with the fiscal rules, and yet I am German enough to believe that we do need a fiscal rule. Well, I'm not German enough to believe that we, for the eternity, need a fiscal rule that is intellectually unsatisfactory because it does not resemble a bit more to the golden rule. And I like to believe that the sun above Christine Lagarde's roof is a golden sun. So maybe some principles of the golden rule find a place also in her construction. If I look at the most recent blueprint for reforming in the euro area, amongst other things, budgetary discipline and the fiscal rules, this Franco-German paper, which is extremely interesting and hard to grasp, well, my initial observation would be, does that work of the German Franco-economists comply with the traditional German principle of intellectual simplicity and ability to be understood by the general public? Maybe as I get older, I diverge more and more in terms of intellectual thickness from the general public, but it is very, very, very sophisticated, and I wonder whether some principle of the golden rule, with all the necessary conventions as to how to weight school toilets, as was very nicely put this morning, and the formation of teachers could not be more evident to the public opinion. Investment is for the future, current consumption is not, then it may be difficult to calculate, but I've seen a lot of complexity in this Franco-German paper, in which, however, appreciated a lot a few things. First of all, what is not there. I would have expected a big insistence institutionally on the fiscal capacity for the euro area and on the finance minister for the euro area. For the time being, you do not put these as a priorities, and I couldn't agree more. We need policy priorities more than institutional priorities. But I must say I'm very, very skeptical about the rule that you put forward, which has the apparent advantage of simplicity because it is a ceiling on the growth rate of nominal public expenditure in each country. Well, I'm a bit uneasy relative to the German principles, because doesn't this imply that a country would give up a bit its fundamental choice about what size of the public sector it wishes to have? I've always liked very much the Treaty of Rome already, very German in its conception, because, for example, it says that as to the ownership of companies, each state is free. But of course, whether companies are publicly owned or privately owned, they have to comply with competition and state aid rules. Similarly, here I would be a bit hesitant in having fiscal rules with, for certainly good purposes, have the side effect of constraining fundamental choices on member states. And I conclude, Madam Chairman, by saying that on the EU budget, much more quickly, this is very little spoken about, but in May this year, the European Commission, at the proposal of German Commissioner Günther Oettinger, is going to present the proposal for the 7-year or 5-year or 10 years, it's still undetermined, financial framework of the EU for after 2020. This will be an extraordinary occasion to either reduce the mutual mistrust that characterizes the relationship between member states right now, or to enhance it. Because unless we are able to go definitively out of this vision of net contributors and net recipients, which totally neglects any value added that the European construction may bring to our citizens, or else we will continue to perish in mistrust. And I was very, very encouraged apropos German contribution to EU policy making at a recent conference in Brussels, in seeing, well, not only Mr. Gabriel, but he is a commissioner, he's not a German authority, but also Mr. Gabriel, they're not from the same party, underline very, very much we are all net beneficiaries, and we have to explain to our citizens in Germany that this is the case, etc., etc. So a lot of new principles are coming up for the budget, the identification which they have also in the German, French-German paper of genuine European public goods, which the budget should provide the means to supply. And I think this will be a very important moment if we want to get a clearer and more genuine and more constructive vision of what the EU is about in the minds of our citizens, and then as a guidance for the next many years of EU activity. Again, the role of Germany here will be absolutely crucial.
Thank you very much, Mario. Let me turn to you, Christoph, now. There have been many proposals, some of which alluded to. There have been Schäuble's proposals way back. There have been President Macron's proposals. There have been President Juncker's proposals. There have been the 14 economists. There will soon be some views, ideas, and suggestions from the IMF as well, because we want to participate in the debate. But you are chair of the German Council of Economic Experts, and you recently published your annual reports with recommendations on euro area reform. So I would like you to now wrap up with that focus, but also touch on the German issues, if you will.
Thank you very much. Indeed, we have been working on this topic of the best European and Euro area architecture for quite some time. Very consistently, I think. We have painted a picture of a solid architecture that is really sustainable. And I'd like to come back to that in the second part of my remarks. But first of all, I will pick up the ball that you just threw over to me and comment on the German situation. Because, of course, the new German government, whatever its exact formation will be, has a tremendously favorable situation at hand. We have talked today about the good state of the German economy. We have seen that the euro area is recovering, and Europe is outstretching their arms. The European leaders are stretching, especially President Macron is stretching out his arms for constructive considerations regarding the further integration of Europe, the further development of a stable euro area. That's great, and the world economy is booming as ours, at least in good shape as well. That's tremendous. But I think that there are two issues, and you asked me, and I'm very happy about that, to comment on these issues where the German government can contribute to this process. One is being a member of a team that is successful, or by being a good, or in order to be a good member of a team that is successful, I think you have to be taking care of yourself. Performing successfully means also that you yourself have to be in good shape. And I think that here, on this issue, the current day, I was not really satisfied with all this discussion, so I'm very happy to comment on that. And the second thing, of course, is to contribute to the team as a functioning team by with several facets of teams, from team spirit to also, like Mario just indicated, taking, let's say, in good times, a little bit more of the burden than those who are in worse shape in the moment. So let's start with the domestic issue. I think that we are very much leading the wrong discussion. And in many respects, the wrong discussion, a phantom discussion actually, that has been dominating the German public debate and economic policy debate for quite some time. That's about rising inequality. Marcel was indicating that the German labor market was very successfully reformed. We have had lots of wage growth starting from the middle of the first decade of the century. And somehow there's the impression that there has been a lot of cost, of social cost involved with that, reflected in large wage inequality and in a lot of menial jobs. And both of these impressions are actually not true. I mean, given the fact that in times of rapid technological change, in times of rapid globalization, the inequality in incomes is exploding all over the world, most tremendously in the United States. It's very much, and it came at some point during the panel discussions that was already mentioned, it's quite a tremendous success that income inequality has taken quite a different route than wage inequality. And why is that the case? For one very specific reason that is disregarded in the public debate, most of it also in Germany, not only internationally, and that's that our system of poverty relief, our tax and transfer system, the German one, is very much redistributive, and that it basically disattaches your success on the labor market from your income position to quite some extent. For the United States, for example, not having a job is really a tremendous challenge for your life. It's not an easy task to come out of unemployment in Germany. I'm not saying that. But in terms of the income that your family receives, you are very much disattached from your labor market success. And that has made it possible that we have had lots of employment growth, unemployment declining, and wage inequality rising, but not income inequality to any extent as near as wage inequality rising. So that means that we should not really conduct this discourse. We should rather think of the two questions that were raised in the previous panel, how to get up wages and how to get up investment. Of course, the answer must be lying a little bit more deeply than to say just we have an exogenous wage increase like Professor Issing was indicating in his provocative question. The question must be, how do we how does German public policy generate a situation that is more prone to innovation, more prone to productivity increase? And I tell you, if I may, I tell you 3 fields of action where you see immediately that the discussion is not enough placed on these issues. One is we are an aging society. Obviously, that puts a lot of strain on the social security systems. We are always talking about old age security provision. We are not so much talking about the health system. But the health system in its organization will contribute about the same or even more to the sustainability gap that we have in the public finances. So here we would need to go to a more market-oriented system. But we have a very centrally planned and overly with lobby groups, dominated by lobby groups, health delivery system. Secondly, our Energiewende, nobody talked about this today, but of course, the fact that Germany is engaging and intends to engage into a transition of its system of energy provision that is turning the whole thing completely around, generating a system that is low on emissions, high in efficiency, dealing with energy issues, with a large extent dependent on renewable sources. That is, of course, a tremendous project. It should be organized in an efficient, in an economically efficient way. It's not at all. It's organized in a very centrally planned way that is extremely expensive. 25 billion per year are going towards electricity surcharge in the moment. And this is only concentrating on electricity. Mobility, the traffic sector, and heating and cooling is not really involved yet. So here we would have to do something. And I come back to this issue in the European part. And the third thing is digitization. We all know that there will be a lot of structural change coming. The labor market will be affected heavily. People have to move from old jobs, established jobs that are challenged to new jobs. At the same time, we are talking about the abolishment of temporary contracts as a way of employing people. So people cannot really test out, and employers cannot really test out whether that's the new job is something for them. So these are just 3 examples where German economic policy could be geared towards potential growth. And by doing so, would also solve the issues that we had before. More investment and more wages would be the reflection of a more innovative economy. Now let's turn to the European part. Again, I think that we should lead the right discussion. The right discussion would not be one where we show to ourselves as intellectual leaders that we think that the process of European integration is a great endeavor. It is, definitely. But I think we need to engage in such reforms and such improvements on the architecture of which we know that which we could be more confident that they don't sow the seed of new conflict while doing so. And that means you have to go back, and now I'm referring to you with your simplicity, with your remark about the German simplicity, or the ability to put complex things into simple formulations, and that would be the liability and control principle. As long as there's no willingness, real willingness to delegate sovereignty, to hand over sovereignty about fiscal issues to a higher level, it's very difficult to talk about joint endeavors, fiscal capacities, and so forth. So I think that the things that one should go about, and that's the original question that you posed, is completing the banking union by, for example, making the resolution schemes more credible, introducing a systemic risk exception that tells you when and when not you should abstain from a bail-in. You should break the link between states and banks more effectively. I think President Weidmann already indicated this morning that treating public debt as any other sort of debt would be, in banking regulation, would be the right step to go. On the fiscal side, introduce or making the no bailout principle more credible by introducing a scheme, a regime, not sovereign insolvency regime, trying to find an independent agency, an independent actor monitoring fiscal discipline, because of course the European Commission takes one instance after another the position that this time the rules are not really meant to apply. So we need somebody else pointing out when the rules are not really adhered to. What we don't need is a fiscal capacity or an investment fund. This is something that is not really at demand. If one wants to do sensible things together, there's a lot of room for that. For example, and I come back to this one example about energy transition, climate policy is an inherent global issue. It should be at least an inherent European issue. Instead of wasting a lot of resources on an ill-fated German energy vendor, one should really go ahead and say, well, we rely on the European trading, emission trading system more heavily. And now, if that is necessary, maybe Germany can contribute more by paying more into this joint scheme than other countries in order to convince other countries that they will participate. But this would be spending disproportionate amounts of own funds on something that is sensible instead of just paying it for symbols. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Christopher. I'm going to take 2 questions from the audience, and then I will take the executive privilege of my position to use the last 2.5 minutes to say a few things about the IMF position. So 2 questions. If you're all too tired for questions, that's okay. Burning questions. Yes, please. Microphone right in the center here.
Just 2 clarifications. Mario, your point about our spending rule was incomplete. So the idea is if there are discretionary increases in taxes, that would be fine. That would be compatible with the rules. So we don't say we want to determine the size of the public sector. But if a country just cuts its taxes, that would not be compatible with the rules. So the spending room would also go down. The idea is just that if you have a recession, you don't need to cut spending. So the idea is to be less counter-cyclical, but of course, every country can have choose its size of the public sector. The other point is about tax reform. I think we are mixing up 2, if we say Germany doesn't need a tax reform, it's so competitive, we are mixing up 2 concepts of competitiveness. We've just today we've discussed German companies are exporting so much and they are all investing abroad. So tax reform is about making sure that they want to invest at home. As a result of US tax reform, incentives will be strong not to invest in Germany, but invest in the US. And this is going to happen because the German government totally ignores this and thinks, it can stabilize investment without cutting taxes in Germany. Germany, after the US tax reform and the French tax reform, Germany will have the highest tax rate in the OECD with the exception of Belgium, which has another, particular tax system. That's why I think that tax reform, in the light of what happens in the US, is a top priority. And, if we want more investment in Germany, one thing we do need is a reform of the German corporate tax system.
Let's just be mindful of one risk, which is when you start racing to the bottom in tax matters, the race to the bottom ends up with everybody at the bottom. You need a degree of revenue as well. I think you will be the last speaker for the questions.
Okay, very quickly, in the interest of time, there has been a lot of debate about private investments and public investments. There's been no talk whatsoever about public-private partnerships. We have 90% private investments, we have 10% public investments, but especially in Germany, my feeling is that the debate about public-private partnerships is a very problematic one. We had earlier about airports in places where they're not needed. I'm in Berlin, we would need one, and perhaps part of the problem is that we are not putting more private money to work here. And my question would be, why is it so difficult in Germany to have more PPP?
I think, Mario, you will address the first questions.
No, it was a
statement more than a question,
by Clemens, of which I take note with great interest.
Perfect. PPP?
I'm happy to tackle that. Because we have been tackling it in the expert committee on raising investment in Germany, and it's very much an emotional issue. So PPPs in Germany are very low in international comparison, and our expert committee actually we propose to say let's get more private investment in big public infrastructure investment projects. And the argument against it is, oh, but that is just a transfer from the public sector to the private sector because the public sector can refinance it much more cheaply, so it's just going to be more expensive. What people don't understand is that it's actually not about financing costs, it's about efficiency and risk sharing. And these two elements are very hard to convey. So I fully agree with you, but it's really an issue, it's really a political issue, where all parties, members of all parties are entirely convinced if you have a PPP for a public highway, that's privatizing the public highway. And that perception is wrong, but I fully agree with you, there would be a lot of potential, not for the financing, because the public sector has relatively low debt overall, it can refinance itself. It's really an issue of efficiency, and I fully agree with there's a lot of potential to be raised.
Okay, thank you very much, Marcel. Now, 10 seconds for you, Benoît.
So that's not about PPPs. Well, even though my experience in my home country is that PPPs are great to leverage private expertise, but too often they've been used also to create off-balance liabilities for the government. So you've got to balance the two. No, I just want to add something totally different because you're going to comment on the IMF. I plea all participants in that discussion looking forward not to forget the global dimension of it. And it's great that today we've been discussing the German challenges and future against a European background, but there is a global background. We have a responsibility to the world, not only in terms of macro outcomes, global imbalances, etc., which has been part of the discussion, but also in terms of leadership in finding a way to deal with globalization. The world is in a great disorder. Let's look around us. So there is great disorder around. Europe is the most successful attempt to deal with globalization. We had our own challenges, but we remain the only successful attempt to deal with globalization at regional level. And we have a lesson to teach to the world, and you've got to get it right. And we have that responsibility to steer that discussion toward a successful conclusion.
Thank you, Benoît. That's a very good intro into my very brief comments. First of all, I would like to thank you, Jens, because I think that the collaboration between the Bundesbank and the IMF has been nothing less than exemplary. And we have, I think, together put a really good set of panels, and I don't know about you, but I found it quite fascinating to hear diverging views on a subject of common interest with you know, the determination to look at least in the same direction. It's often the definition of love, so who knows. So thank you so much. So what did we learn from those discussions? I'm not going to try to summarize the 1, 2, 3, 4 panels we had actually, including ours. But I was very surprised, and I thank you, Christoph, for having kicked the ball over to my camp by mentioning innovation, by mentioning those new sectors of development, and you, Benoît, for having brought actually the global background and landscape within which the euro area and Germany are operating together. But it was, I have to say, quite refreshing today not to hear once the words artificial intelligence, quantum computing, the fourth technology revolutions, industrial revolution. And we will hear plenty of that next week, because the media will pick up the Davos discussions, and it will be very much about that. Yet, this is also very much about how the way the world is changing around us, and the way in which Germany, particularly with its very strong industrial manufacturing economy with a strong export component, is also going to be affected by this phenomenon. So clearly, things have to be changed, because as many of the speakers this morning particularly said, Germany is just not an island. And Germany is also changing intrinsically because of its demographic challenge. Aging is one, migration and the way in which it deals with migration in the future certainly has a dimension which needs to be taken into account, and its productivity growth is low. So, key priority is, in our view, to raise long-term growth. We talked a lot about growth potential, and we certainly are on that page as well. But clearly, the recipes of the past, which have served Germany well, are not necessarily the recipes that are going to demonstrate effectiveness going forward. But the good news from our perspective is that Germany has many tools in its hands. First of all, Germany's current account surplus is large. I think by all accounts, even the most reluctant to admit it, would now admit that at 8% of GDP or thereabout, it's not certainly too large. And this means that there is an excess of saving over investment, which suggests that Germany can afford to spend and invest more. And I think we also all pretty much agreed, except for this sovereign fund proposal, which was interesting, that this investment would be better if it was domestic, whether it's public, private, jointly public-private, provided that it is efficient and at home. I would concur with you, Benoît, that the current account surplus is also a problem from a global perspective. The reduction of Germany's surplus will help reduce global imbalances, which clearly we are concerned at the IMF. And the rise of rampant protectionism or protectionism threats is certainly not unrelated to the accumulation of current account surpluses in some countries. So I think we need to be just mindful and play according to responsibilities on a global basis as well. Second tool that Germany has, it has fiscal space. And when I heard you say that everybody should be building buffers, within the euro area, I'm not sure that it applies to absolutely all euro area members, and there are some that with the fiscal space that they have can also afford to use some of it. The budget is in surplus, the public debt ratio is declining rapidly, and the research that we've done actually demonstrates that even with some investment of that fiscal surplus, the debt continues to decline on a trend basis. So Germany can use this fiscal space to pursue growth-friendly policies, policies that will equip Germany to respond to that changing world that I was describing earlier. Not to help others, but to make sure that its economy is strong, is sustainable moving forward. The third tool that it has is that wage growth in Germany have been rising, but still is a bit subdued, if only because there was an element of catching up over a period of time. So there is scope for wages to respond more actively to the very strong labor market. Clearly, it's not going to be policy-driven, but communication can certainly help, as was mentioned this morning, and can help lift inflation expectations, which we heard today are important in the wage-setting process in Germany. So, bottom line, looking at the European perspective very quickly, yes, it is time to repair the roof, because although it's not been the case very much in December, as I heard here in Frankfurt, but yes, the sun is shining on the global economy, and that will be demonstrated in the numbers that Maury will be commenting upon on Monday in Davos. And the current growth momentum in Europe provides that opportunity to fix the roof, to reform the architecture. We certainly strongly believe that banking union should be a first order of priority, completed, as you described it, Christoph, with all its attributes. Capital markets union, which very few people disagree upon, and certainly a deeper fiscal union that we believe is necessary. I just would like to take 1 second as a reformed lawyer, and as an aging one, to actually refer to the grandfathering principle. Because just as we've heard you, Jens, indicate that banking union and common deposit is okay, provided that there has been enough cleaning up and responsibilities are honored at the domestic level. You did not seem to exclude that going forward. So leave alone the stock, the future, if there is doubt about it, but at least going forward for the future, having grandfathered for the past, certainly the principle of that banking union could be considered. Just a suggestion. You know, grandfathering is always helpful when you want to change without completely rocking the boat. And in a way, that could apply also to central fiscal capacity. There will be massive new needs coming up, whether it's in the field of energy, whether it's in the field of massive computing going forward. That will require significant investment base, probably way beyond any of the 19 members of the euro area. When you look at what China is considering to invest, when you look at what is separately and more privately invested on the west coast of California, Europe needs to be on that scene as well. Second, clearly, to take reforms at the national level, rebuilding buffers, raising productivity is one aspect which I agree with you, Benoît, should be tackled. So I was personally very pleased to see that the first 3 pages of the, 28 pages of the coalition agreement between the various parties having that debate in Germany had a strong and preliminary focus on European issues. And we know that German leadership will be essential in advancing reforms in Europe, will be essential in fixing that roof. As I said, not any roof. Probably a roof that is more sustainable, that is more intelligent, and that will keep the economy going forward. Because Germany is not an island, not isolated, and deep down at heart, it is a good player, and it wants to be part of that game. So with that, we conclude our session. And again, thank you very much, Jens, for having co-organized together with us at the IMF this debate. We will be taking the show down the road, and we'll be having a similar debate, although different contexts, substance and attributes in France mid-February, and then we will carry on in a few other European countries. Thank you so much for having attended.